I was going to give a talk about reincarnation until I realized all of you, just today, I realized that all of you were expecting something about after death communication. So I switched it. It's a little bumpy, but I'll do it. I do love to work with dead people. I just adore it. You never know what's going to happen. It's always a surprise. I really follow the dead are always right idea, which many mediums do, and fascinated by the worlds that they create for themselves. And when you're in their environments, which that's what interests me the most, being in their environments, knowing how they've changed, where they're developing, what they're doing, you get a glimpse of an entirely different kind of consciousness, a kind of consciousness that understands deeply that they are eternal. And with that, there's tremendous shifts, tremendous changes. You also see undreamed of capabilities that they come up with and create incredible creativity. Extraordinary, ever-changing landscapes, not always, but through afterlife communication, we finally step into our really true state, and that's the state of immortality. I want to just tell a little story, and I don't want two of you are from Vienna, but it's happened to me in Vienna. And the point of telling the story is to show how culturally, how our cultures shape what happens to us after we die. And I was doing readings and doing mediumship and starting to teach and all of that sort of thing in Austria. And I started noticing that almost all of the people I was reaching in the afterlife were sitting around in kitchens waiting for the rest of their families. And I thought it was so consistent that I thought I had lost it. I thought that really I had blown my ability to do this until my students started coming up with exactly the same scenarios for their grandparents and so forth. This was an expression. What happens to you after you die has a lot to do with expectation and a lot to do with your inner optimism, whether it's there or it's not there, or fatalism, whether it's there or not there. And in this case, this was conservative Catholics whose job it was to wait for the whole family before they could do anything. And that's just exactly what they did. And it's the same with my students when they reach their ancestors. But tonight, I want to, instead of talking about what the communication with the afterlife, a word I dislike, by the way, afterlife is not a good word. We don't have a good word. This is not a place or a time locality. It has nothing to do with any of that. This is the survival of consciousness and what it creates around itself. So, but tonight I'm going to emphasize a little bit more on why the dead people need us, why they need our communication instead of always flipping it the other way, what they can do for us. They can warn us not to take that road where you would have died if you had done it in the car. That they will give us the proper lotto number, and that has happened. Those sorts of things, but their real need. So Wendy, you asked me, why did I write this book? And one of them is because of that, because of their need to be the voice for their need, because their voices are not heard enough. But first was the overall condition of the planet that labors and is captivated by the fear of death. And we are held captive, rather. And when you think about what that does, especially now in COVID period where it's the fear of death is completely risen to the surface, there's almost nothing you can name that isn't controlled somehow by the fear of death. The way we teach history, war to war, for instance, anthropology, all of the periods of human epics are about weaponry, the Stone Age, the Copper Age, the Bronze Age. These are all about weapons. Economics and constant growth. Medical industry, unbelievable what that does in terms of boosting our fear of death. And the health industries, including the alternative ones, pharmaceuticals and insurance naturally, and the media, incredible. So we live constantly bombarded with fear of death or pictures of death. It just doesn't stop. And this is something that I'm not going to get into, but just to say, developed in the 5th century before Christ with the formation of the Yahweh cult. And I can, I write about that in the book. And if any of you have questions about that, you can ask me a little later. So that's the first thing. The second reason why I wrote this is to normalize after death communication. It's an inborn ability. Everybody has it. Everybody has telepathy. That darling cat there you have is purely, telepathic. Your cells are operating with telepathy. We can, through telepathy, influence machines. So can baby chicks. So as Wendy mentioned, I've given an awful lot of workshops. And because it's such a natural gift, given the right environment and the right support, you can get, which I get, 98 to 99% success on people reaching who they wanted to reach in the afterlife. The third is because of a man named Michael, who I watched him struggling to get in his body, get out of his body, and then the resuscitation process brought him back in again. I was very close to him, and he tried to get in touch with me. It went on for about 11 days where I avoided him. And the fax was, in those days, we had a fax machine, constantly whirring. The phone was constantly ringing. The front door in New York City is very bad to have a front door that was constantly opened in the morning. And sort of things like that with the lights. The dad are very gifted with communicating through electronics. And that was so was Michael. And one Sunday afternoon, I couldn't stand it anymore. He was standing in the kitchen and he was obviously in tremendous panic. His eyes were rolling with panic. He was in fear that he didn't exist anymore. Because I wasn't responding, nobody was responding. He didn't know if he still existed. And finally, I turned to him and we started communicating, and his whole, I'm having more and more difficulty speaking English. Can't remember the words in English, they come in German now. His whole demeanor changed. He stood up, as though he grew, he started to shine. Little fireworks were going off from glee and relief. And that led to an hour and a half of straight communication in which we laughed, cried, and even argued. And this man has never left me. Last year, in December of last year, my students, we had a Christmas party, and the Christmas party, we moved tables around, just putting our hands on them. And Michael always showed up. And it took him all these years to finally start to get control over physical reality. And this year, his presence was so strong that these students these heavy, heavy tables were levitating up above their heads. So this is a sort of thing that I've had a lot of experience with dead family and friends who have performed physical mediumship with me, a lot. And I don't want to go into much, as one I could mention just to show you how simple it can be. It can be very complex as well, things really moving or things that are taken apart and left apart with one piece missing, things appearing out of nowhere, which has happened to me since the death of my husband. This is the first husband who died shortly after our marriage, very shortly, a little more than a week. And because they didn't know what he was dying from, they put him in a quarantine with a glass front. So he was in a cubicle by himself with a lung machine. And he died around 4:30 in the morning, and I got home around 5. And on my answering machine was a message from him. That's this is the sort of thing I'm talking about. And it was a message of thanks. I know it's hard to believe that we're really communicating with something. It's hard for us really to believe that what we're feeling or what we're perceiving in any way, visually or otherwise, is really in existence in another plane, in another reality. That is obviously because we have been schooled since birth, that the only reality is physical. Nevertheless, there are just too many instances, too many anecdotes, stories that, as Victor says, is evidence, not proof, but evidence of the afterlife, that we should try to invest more faith in this action. I'm happy, I'm very blessed because so many of my dead friends were gifted and did so many things for me in terms of physical proof. My husband of 21 years died in December of last year, and suddenly and supposedly unexpectedly, which is really not the truth. Communication with him was immediate and frequent, sometimes several times a day, sometimes every 2 or 3 days, but it was rather relatively constant. And I can tell you right now that nothing helps a person through grief better than that. When I first contacted him, he wasn't in good shape. He was in something almost comatose condition, and I was very worried, and it affected me without realizing how much his condition affected my condition. The reason is because his brain, he went through brain damage shortly, very, very swiftly and I think he was just not sure where he was or what had happened to him. Anyway, with some help with me and Verena, who is here with us tonight, we got him in. And the doctors in Austria told me that I'd have to wait after the autopsy for possibly 1 to 2 weeks before I could find out why he died. And then Walter came in the meantime, and I was amazed that he told me that he witnessed his own autopsy. And he gave me very, very detailed information about why he died, what was wrong with his body. But the main thing was a tear in his aorta, which explained everything to me. When I finally did meet with the doctors, they told me that he died from a heart attack. Well, who doesn't? And, oh, yes, he had a tear in his aorta. So he bled internally to death. So these are just some examples of how the interchange can go. His need, Walter's need to tell me why he died, Michael's need to be visible, and Jacques' need, the first husband's need to thank me. These are all needs coming from them, and unfortunately, we often do not respond to that, especially the way we do not respond to all of the subtle signs they give us to try to get our attention. And I'm going to give you a list of those shortly. Now, there are problems that occur in the afterlife occur largely because sometimes from a denial, I'm not dead, which is surprisingly common, or death happened too quickly, like in the case of a murder or an accident. I've worked with a number of murdered people who have come out of their pictures, incredibly powerful instances, especially when the perpetrator is not found or unknown. And sometimes they have difficulty after death and need us. This is what the theme is for tonight, because they left too many things unresolved, in particular, reconciliation with family and friends. Um, and I worked with people in the afterlife who couldn't go on because of deeply repressed memories, such as childhood rape, especially those who were raped during World War II here in Europe. No one spoke of that. You just go silent on that. And until these things are concluded or brought out, and it's never too late, they can't go on. Understanding the beauty of death, the necessity of death, so that we can continue to expand and create, excuse me, will go a long way eliminating any problems. What happens after death is greatly influenced, of course, by our beliefs and our expectations. And a person such as what I would call an angry atheist may absolutely deny survival after death and stay in a sort of non-existent cocoon. Or a person who is optimistic and also atheist will just simply be delighted at this new magic world that he or she stepped into. So really, inner optimism is usually all that it takes to arrive in a world of utter magic. And it is. Generally, the people who are having problems in the afterlife are exactly those who are not heard. If you see these, many of the mediums today who walk around and do this really fast sort of mediumship stuff, many of them very gifted, but generally what you hear is, oh, he's doing fine and nothing else. And that's very true, especially in the spiritualism groups in England. They don't focus on what's going on in this other reality or these other realities. And that is something that is, here you go, I have one, unsatisfying to me and doesn't bring us forward in much of any way. So a lot of these people who are not heard need help. And that's why when I do the segments on afterlife, I have a strong influence on, or emphasis on rescue work, which is when students or myself, we will go and find a person, find out the story, and make the change. It's an incredibly fast work. So several times during the seminars, I bring material in of some kind of a natural disaster or an attack, a terrorist attack or something of that sort, where a number of people lost their lives. And I had one of these all straightened out for a class for that coming weekend. And Friday night came another disaster that was not my disaster, it was another disaster of an apartment building that burned to the ground in London and took a lot of people with it. So when that happened, Raina, were you I don't know if you were in that class or not, I don't think so. So instead of this disaster that I planned, I had to switch to the other one because these people, these dead people who had died from smoke, and many could smell the smoke, were really agitated by the smoke in the class, were coming to us for help. And so that's what we did. We worked really, really hard. In the meantime, one of the students, in her sleep, acquired a tattoo on her upper arm. And this tattoo it was just a small sign that neither of us could understand. She sent photos of it to me. Both of us started to research the internet to find out what this sign meant. And we found it. And the sign was Tanarok. It's a language that's it's a language that's written for Berber. These are the written signs to describe Berber language of Morocco, and this Tipanak symbol that we got meant thank you. I looked up the victims of this fire, and many of them were Berbers. So I want to go on now to subtle signs because I want you to be alert in your everyday lives of when our departed are trying to get our attention and how often we can let that opportunity slip away. Now, most of these signs are very subtle and they can evaporate in seconds, especially sounds, if you don't know how to work with them. So working with them is the first thing we need to look at. The worst thing you can do is to start looking around for where the origin of the sound is, or to focus anything outside of yourself, but to switch and focus internally, your inner mind, your mind's eye, as we would say. So that if you get something, let's say I smell like roses, or maybe the favorite flower of the person who's trying to reach you. And a rose may be something that is a happy birthday present or a congratulatory thing that someone has sent. And but instead of looking at that rose or trying to see an origin, trying to see where it may have come from, what we should do with that is to take that and put that in our mind's eye and focus on it in a relaxed but very focused way, very intensely focused way, until that rose begins to tell its story. So going still and focusing inwardly is the first step with any signs that the dead may be near. There are, if you are very, very gifted, you don't need many of these signs. You just automatically get to it. You'll automatically know what's going on. There was a situation in my apartment in New York where these awful odors of ammonia were coming through. And I had two visitors, and the two of them were coughing, their eyes were watering, and they ran out of the room. I didn't smell anything. I didn't smell anything because I saw who it was. And it resulted in this man speaking for about an hour and a half afterwards. So these manifestations of odors or sounds or whatever are ways for them to try to get our attention when they're having difficulty getting our attention. And that's when we experience them. If you try to focus on what comes from the outside, it will go. It will disappear, evaporate right within seconds. Again, sounds such as a person's footsteps, a way of coughing, a voice. You might even hear your name called. I'm sure many of you have had these kinds of experiences. Clear and sharp in the middle of the air, your name called. Go still, internalize, and wait. In pure focus, wait until information starts to flow. Now, there's more to do than that, but that's just for this one step as we go through the subtle signs. Not so subtle are the electronic and electrical phenomena. They can fill whole books, and they do. Power surges, light bulbs blinking off and on or burning out as soon as you put a new one in. Lights turned on, radios turned on, televisions flickering. I know people who've seen the faces of their departed loved ones on the computer just pop up. Telephone rings, fax, if you still have that, answering machines of all kinds, stove heats up, mixer, anything is possible. Clocks stop working, even often with significance. They may point to the time of death or whatever, especially if you are not aware that someone has died. One of the stories that I love to tell is of this young woman and her husband in bed, and this woman realizes that her grandmother is there visiting and tries to wake her husband so that she can share the event with him. And so she's trying to wake him up, and he says, oh, come on, that's junk. I don't want to hear that. I want to go back to sleep. So what happens is that from the top floor down, every electrical device turned on. I mean everything, everything in the kitchen, even if it was unplugged. And the lights were turned on outside. And this, of course, was a display of the grandmother. This is what she was doing, possibly out of rage, that her granddaughter's husband didn't believe she was there. Well, he certainly did soon after that. It scared him to death. And eventually, those signs subsided into communication, and that's the point. A real stunner. The telephone, I have a lot written in my book about how technology, which I consider the art of our era, has influenced and supported and pushed us psychically. Because what happens, think of the internet, how similar it is to these kind of realities that exist outside of time, that, that they're always right there. Everything is right there. There's no other place to be but here. And in the internet, you have all these different pages, websites, entirely different world differences, one page away. Always, only one page away. When you think of cell phones and things of that sort, all of these things emit electronic energy. And electronic energy is actually what most of manifestation is made of. And since we are bombarded with it day in and day out, we're beginning to read the finer levels of electronic energy and its forms. And through that, we get to see more subtle levels of reality. And I think that is a big reason why we're seeing an upsurge in our time of these abilities. But the telephone is without precedence. There's a telephone, Alexander Graham Bell in Philadelphia, presenting the first time publicly the telephone. Huge audience. And the phone rings and he picks it up and they have something that amplifies the voice that's coming through, and the voice that's coming through is unbelievably Shakespeare's to be or not to be. That is the question. With the skull, see, Alexander Graham Bell did believe that after he finished inventing the telephone, he would invent a communication device that could communicate with the dead. Well, what the audience thought was he had done that he had conjured the dead, and there was panic throughout. But since then, the idea of communicating with something you can't see, that's not within reach, that's, from the other side of the world, has brought us to an absolutely new height of understanding what it means to communicate with those who are mostly invisible, I'll say, who are certainly and definitely not even on our planet, but somehow within our own reality. Anyway, we have books of things, of the telephone being used as a metaphor for telepathy, which it certainly is. We have so much evidence of this woman who died in a hospice, and her son kept getting the phone calls from her. They tracked the phone calls to her room, but she'd been dead for 3 or 4 hours. People talking for an hour and a half with someone, not knowing they were already dead. People talking on phones that are not even connected because there's no service, because there are no phone lines anywhere. So the phone really is the biggest of all symbols. But the devil do other things. They'll come out of pictures, or they'll make pictures fall, and books fall and open up to specific pages where personal messages can be read. Things move in so many strange ways when you have people who die and find their feet, so to speak, quickly enough. I've had so many incredible demonstrations of their abilities just shortly after their death. It's just astonishing. My husband and I sit there and watch things moving with our jaws dropped. So the range of physical phenomena is limitless, and it is through the dead that physical mediumship is accomplished. So The idea of intrusive thoughts or sudden inspiration often signal the intrusion of another mind, another consciousness, most likely someone you know. Music, which all of my friends on the other side, family on the other side, they all have musical tags that they use. So it's like in setting your ringtone to a specific song. When you hear music or you realize that you're listening to music in your head over and over and over again, once you realize that, go still. Think about that piece of music. Think about what the lyrics, if there are lyrics, might mean. And wait until you start getting pictures. Most of you will get pictures. It used to be that most people got audio, but now since we're so image oriented, most of us see these things as inner pictures. Music is one of the easiest ways for them to come through, but it's a very subtle way. Most of us don't even realize what we're singing in our heads, any more than we realize what we're thinking most of the time. Oddly enough, grief waves. Suddenly you burst into tears, you don't know why, you're sobbing all over the place. Well, that usually means that the object of your grief is right there. Happens all the time. So stop what you're doing. You can cry, you can scream, you can do all that, but stay still. Just stay inwardly still and look for images and messages. And once you locate something, start communicating with it. If you feel that you're not communicating, start asking questions. But every time you ask a question, stay still and wait for an answer. Don't rush. If you don't get an answer, even doing that, ask another question or restate the question. You can be kind of bullish with dead people. Sometimes I just scream at them, get down here right now, or get over here right now. They're fine with that. They're fine with all of your emotions. The stronger your emotions are, the better you're going to be able to make a bridge between them and us. If you're faking your emotion, they know it anyway. So what's the point? It'll just block any communication. My favorite of all the signs of the presence of the departed is this sensation of tingling. It's like an electrical energy that streams through the body, sometimes in more above and below. But in the class work, we've had times where it was so strong people couldn't stand up anymore. Usually it's just plain pleasurable, but it's a flow also of information and should be very earnestly observed, experienced, and then deepened. And you deepen that again by internalization. This is a purely, most of the world is glued together by the electronic activity. There's no question about that. And this is a very strong stream of it when this tingling happens. If I'm working with somebody, say, I'm here in France and I'm working with somebody in New Zealand and the dead person turns up, we're both going to feel it. Absolutely the same second. Doesn't matter where you are. All those realms are non-local. They have nothing to do with time. They have nothing to do with space. When I'm talking about focusing, I want you to go one step further. Focus is, of course, the major thing. I want you to go one step further and say you've got somebody in mind you want to communicate with. You should call that person. You can be, again, a little commanding. Call that person, say to that person, I need to see you as you are now, okay? And then wait. Wait until a picture comes into your mind. You'll start to gradually feel some sort of awareness from something else. Now, what you want to do is to make contact with that other awareness. You want to go in synchronicity with that other awareness. And that's a feeling when you achieve that, you get a feeling of being in. And the example that I always give is when you're talking to somebody and the other person is making all the right gestures, the facial gestures and everything, as though he or she were listening, but you know this person is not listening. And I know we've all had that experience. I don't mean to imply that we're all boring, but I know we've all had that experience. And then there's a certain point where suddenly something clicks and there's like an opening and you feel in a synchronicity, and then you know that person is listening. It's exactly that click that we look for. That click which signals that we're in synchronicity, at least mentally, with a departed person of our choice. So you want to hold that. And then you want to ask questions. And then you want to wait for answers. And generally, you will see those answers in terms of gestures. If they are newly dead, they will often use words. But after a while, they stop doing that, and you just know what they mean. It's sort of a direct knowing. You just simply know. And don't forget to just keep asking questions, and waiting for answers while you know you are in synchronicity with a person of your choice. Now, what brings up grief too is an obsessive kind of way of drifting back to the death scene. And this is a way that I just want to mention. It's kind of like an intrusive memory. You can't sort of get away from the accident that killed your son, or the deathbed scene of your husband or whatever. And this is a way of holding on to the dead person in a way that he no longer is, or she no longer is. And your best thing when this occurs is to instantly pull yourself up and say, I want to see him as he is now. And generally, they're in much better shape than we are. They should be ashamed of themselves for leaving us in such shape, but anyway, they don't. They do. And so that's what you want to do in order to shift that, to stop going back to this horrid scene, this indelible memory. Change it and see how he or she looks now, probably younger, certainly more vibrant and whole. Now, people don't realize this, but dead people don't remember their deaths that well. Oh yeah, it's like getting over a cold to them very often. It's like a little thing, because where they are now is even stronger than where they are in the flesh. It's a stronger experience in the afterlife. However they create it for themselves. And they can create things that are intense. They can create things that are so unworldly that they're almost impossible to translate even visually. And they can also create hells of their own making. Anything goes.